3 years he did. This year, other teaching has kept him from actually being so actively involved, but I insisted that he came back and gave us his talk about information, his presentation, visualization, and problems thereof. Now, those of you from design and technology will already know Ted, at least to some extent. You probably don't know his biography though, but the rest of you do need an introduction to Ted. He's been teaching in Parsons for the last 10 years within art, media and technology, which roughly speaking describes Ted's range of interests anyway. But this doesn't begin to capture his wider work. For 20 years he's worked at the intersection of art, activism, publishing and new technologies as a director, advisor, organizer, editor, moderator and collaborator with a wide range of civil society entities, foundations and academic and public interest publishers. He's consulted for the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, SRI, BBC, The Kitchen, and an Amsterdam foundation called Lock, is that right? Okay. And the Berlin Documentary Forum. His work on technical and cultural dimensions of network governance has been commissioned by the Open Society Institute, has been cited in congressional testimony, and taken up by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. In the last decade, he was a Design Trust for Public Space Journalism Fellow, a contributor to the Social Sciences Research Council International Cooperation Working Group Series, an Open Society Institute grant recipient, and he was visiting fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project. Most recently, he co-founded the Open Syllabus Project, a Sloan Foundation-funded research network dedicated to bringing much-needed transparency to higher education by transforming isolated ephemeral syllabi into a large-scale, publicly accessible resource. Before all this, he worked as a publisher, as an editor for publishers as varied as Pantheon's own books, The New Press, DIA, Serpent's Tail, Verso, Cambridge, Oxford, and MIT. Before that, in turn, as a theatre technician, he worked with member of the Wooster Group, Richard Foreman, Survival Research Laboratories, and Todd Haynes, among others. Finally, he's shown his own artwork, both in the US, notably the double exhibition at the then infamous Pattern and American Fine Arts Galleries, and across Europe. So, I'll say no more, except that I think Ted to be one of the smartest faculty in Parsons. Ted.
Okay, hi everyone. Is this, can you hear me okay if I stay back a bit?
Oh, Ted, yeah, take this. See you soon. Good enough.
The game should. How's that? Good? Okay, good. Anyway, so this is, how long have you been teaching this course now? So this is the 4th year, and so this is given a variant of this talk each and every year. And it's as I spend more time researching this, I find that it's harder and harder to sort of find an entry point to talk about these things because the subjects have become, the things that I'm going to talk about have become so pervasive. In the past, I felt like I needed to explain why this subject was important. It's becoming more and more clear why these sort of questions of the ability to sort of master large amounts of information has a serious impact. But in any event, we can move past that. So the things that I'm going to talk about have lots of different names. They start with very humble tools, things like bar charts, pie charts, and this kind of stuff. They move into much more kind of complex and elaborate forms of the kind that you see, some of which are taught here, and I think which are almost sort of universally held up as examples of ways to sort of find your way through the sort of like the jungle of information, the jungle of complexity. We're told again and again that there's some sort of information revolution, that we live in an information society that has absolutely transformed the nature of life on this earth and so on and so forth. And to a certain extent it has, but at the same time, there are many things that, as I'm trying to show you, remain kind of historically continuous. This is the website that was in fact put together by an MFET graduate, Manuel Lima. I'll talk about his work a little bit. What I'm going to try to do is give you, roughly speaking, a kind of a base vocabulary for beginning to understand how to disassemble these things and understand that in many ways they're just a new form of rhetoric, a new form of visual rhetoric, and that they don't represent any sort of transformative way of understanding the world, and in fact they can be quite reactionary, and that they are in many ways an effort to sort of restore a sense of order on an increasingly complicated world. So, you'll know from various websites, some of which become quite popular, with these things like information is beautiful. You can tell very easily what message you are being told, right? In many cases, these have a slightly sort of imperative quality to them. Now, I've been thinking about these things for longer than I care to mention, and for various reasons. My own background academically was I spent time studying the history of the end of the world, this thing that never happens but they keep on promising. And as I'll show you a little bit later, the origins of data visualization and these kinds of tools in fact come from certain kinds of historical discourse, and that their origins are not technical or informational, but in fact in many cases are religious. This is an image of Senator John Glenn staring at a gigantic diagram. I think this is from 1997, a congressional testimony where the Republicans were going after Clinton, trying to prove that the Chinese had been trying to influence American politics. He's staring at this thing very intently. And this is what he said about it. Blah, blah, blah. I'm a cancer. Where do I fit in? Right? Now, this is an interesting thing. This is a man he was one of the first astronauts, and beyond that had been a test pilot for quite some time. So his familiarity with engineering, with mathematical issues was like absolutely unparalleled, especially in the realm of practical application. But when he saw these things, strangely enough, I think that he saw them for what they are. Here is another popular representation of him that I think captures in a strange way some of the anxiety associated with the ability to sort of shift in terms of scale and to move beyond the world that we had known for millennia, and to construct these sort of viewpoints, but rather than sort of address it in a sort of frightful way, right? It's a sort of this tremendous sort of transformational threshold, and said what we see is a smiling man peering from behind the earth saying, it's okay, right? No problem at all. Now, he was born, I think, in 1916 or something like that. And I want to give you a rough sense of an element of data visualization and information design that has been largely neglected. And I think it'll give you a better sense of understanding what the real task is here. This is the cockpit of a Sopwith biplane from 1918, so roughly the year in which Senator Glenn was born. And it gives you a rough sense of the kinds of instrumentation that we use by a pilot to determine things that we take for granted on the ground. For example, what's up, what's down, what's right, what's left, how far how fast are you moving? All these sort of different things to take for granted. But when you start to lose established frames of reference, for example, gravity, or not gravity, but just the ability to sort of to understand your place and its visual relationship to the world, our ability to construct these sort of impossible situations requires a sort of additional effort. This is what a plane cockpit looked like in 1918. This is what it looked like during World War II. This is what it looked like in, I think, 1989 or so, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And this is a cockpit for the space shuttle. So, if you want to talk about complexity, here you go. If you want to talk about the difficult relationship between visuality and where you are and the sort of story that you're telling or the life that you're living, here you are. And I want to point out one other thing, and that is that here you have a relatively unobstructed view. This is a sort of simple architectural object in the sense that your head is sticking out and you can pretty much see what's going on. But as these things become more and more complex, you begin to see that seeing the world in a sort of experiential way ceases to have meaning, and instead what we need to do is to see it supplemented with all of this sort of instrumentation. Now, for the most part, the history of data visualization and information design is couched in terms of print. More recently, I think one of the main reasons that the subject has taken off is because we started to construct these much more complex visual things in the form of interaction design and so on and so forth. But there are entire segments of this history that get left out. I've never once, in all of the probably 15 years of reading that I've done on the subject, seen anyone mention aeronautical instrumentation as one of the foundations for this stuff. And yet, in the post-war period, this was really, in many ways, the testing ground of what happened. This is one of my favorite visualizations. I'm surprised that I learned about it so recently. This was produced by Rockwell in 1989. And in it, they not just sort of like what's roughly going on, but the history of all humanity going into the future. And so, for example, you can see that, around 1983 or so, we had the first generation of reusable spacecrafts and so on and so forth. If you look down, you can start to see that they're talking about permanent human presence in space. And I think they were roughly on schedule for that. But as you travel farther down through this, you start to get, for example, to where we are now, where we're supposed to be evolving to explore extraterrestrial resources. And we're supposed to have had a biplanetary civilization. It gets better. In 5 years, apparently, we're going to command unlimited material resources from the moon and asteroids, and soon thereafter, we'll have unlimited safe solar energy for the Earth. And it's hard for me to imagine a better sort of allegory in a way. And again, I want to emphasize that these are not as technocratic as this may seem. In fact, in many ways, this is a very traditional image expressed in a very unfamiliar idiom. That if we go back and look at this, what you see is a tremendous model of interdependency and complexity. It's a sort of vast Rube Goldberg that described how we're going to leave the Earth or something like that. And everything is going to go fine as long as we don't do things like start wars in the Middle East or, end up being overrun by code warlords or something like that. And what you see overall is that the function of this, by sort of taking a very sort of like light isolated plane of human existence, yes, it simplifies, yes, it clarifies, and yes, it presents an image of the world that is absolutely and hopelessly impossible and is never going to happen, at least not at the rate that we're going. It gets better still when we get down toward the end, when Gaia proliferates and there's human expansion into the cosmos, right? So, again, the details get a little thin in this area, but that is the sort of mad project that was undertaken by Rockwell. It is indicative of a level of planning within these kinds of aerospace and increasingly surveillance organizations that gives you an indication of the depth of how they have been planning and how long they've been planning. There are many, many such diagrams that we will never see to describe financialization. They describe surveillance, they describe urban planning, and so on and so forth, but they're not for us. Now, in a way, all of these images are the sort of underlying rhetoric, when you strip away the details, are intent upon producing this sort of strange discourse of one of a kind of like, one of a sort of sense of peace and contentment. The idea that that not just that we're sort of masters of our world, but that we can sort of like float fluidly through it and understand things. And you begin to see from the symbolist painting, I think from around maybe 1910 or so by Baudelaire and Redon, a very different a very different sort of visual rhetoric that sort of speaks of what has become a very technocratic enterprise. Do you know the band the Mekons? They're from around your hometown, I think. You don't. It's a shame. Anyway, they're a very fine post-punk band. And these are the lyrics of a song that they put out, I think, around 1990 or so, right after the collapse of communism. That very neatly describes, again, in a very different idiom, a lot of the rhetoric that's driving the sort of data visualization. But here, rather than having it presented in a technocratic discourse, again, what we see is something that's a bit more poetic about the ability of human beings, in some sense, to leave the Earth and to look down upon it, which I guess we probably need to do. So, have you had James talk yet? Okay, so you guys have all heard about scaling, right? This beautiful thing, this sort of mathematized representation of the world. The idea of scaling is, I think, an effort to sort of box in and frame a lot of the sort of increasing complexity that we begin to sort of take, that we begin to see as our sort of subjective experience moves beyond our physical experience, and we start to sort of, start to take in very, very different ways of sort of understanding the world, and the scope changes really dramatically. I think that you're probably fairly familiar with this film by now. It's widely heralded as a classic of modernist design, Powers of 10 by the Gameses. It's a strange and problematic thing. It shows this viewpoint moving away in a serene and sort of apparently sort of consistent path along a single axis. But as you start to move from a sort of portraiture to a landscape, through this sort of succession of different suburban planning, and as we watch this and continue to watch this, we'll begin to see the rise of sort of cartography and political geography. You'll see the visual idiom shifting really dramatically. Here we're starting to get something more toward regional planning, geology, and as you follow it, eventually we'll end up going into sort of realms of sort of astronomy and even cosmology. I don't think that we have time to watch the entire thing. It's strange to me that this is held up as a classic of design. It is in some ways, and I left out the soundtrack. If you haven't heard it, you should. It's a sort of slightly comical version of the sort of voice of science talking. The original version of the film, I think, was released in 1968. In 1967, the year before it was released, Disney came out with a movie, or not a movie, a ride, an entire ride at Disneyland that used exactly the same rhetoric. You would sit in this kind of egg-shaped car. I remember this from when I was young. And sort of like go back and forth looking at these things, and you'd shrink down and down and down and watch a gigantic eyeball looking at you, and you'd gradually be reduced to the subatomic. It's a shame that we don't have this, wasn't able to get the sound working, because you hear a very different reassuring model of like sort of model of a sort of scientific voice. But this is a rough video capture, as far as I know, the only one that exists in public of what you would see in this environment as you shrink. So at this point, what in the realm of design is held up to be a modernist classic, in other realms becomes pure pop entertainment, right? In some ways, the sort of campiest kind. Many years before that, well, 11 years before that, there's we have these other sort of like these blips and blops of sort of scaling going on. This film, The Incredible Shrinking Man from 1957, depicts some poor guy who was out riding in his boat and goes through something that seems to be electromagnetic, seems to be sort of radioactive, and he starts to shrink and shrink and shrink. And by the end of the film, he's finally given up in many ways to me, because he sort of sets off on his own amidst these sort of towering blades of grass on this heroic journey. But before that, he ends up in these strange situations where it's a fantastic film to watch, where he's just getting smaller than his wife. Mm-hmm. But in that regard, I think as well, we begin to sort of this kind of image and this kind of film asks to sort of suggest that we can start to ask about the subjective position that is shrinking. And I would suggest to you that one way to think of it is that it has to do with the shrinking sort of prestige of masculinity in the post-war period, the shrinking prestige of patriarchy, the shrinking prestige of whiteness, and the path beginning to walk toward a world that we understand now, what was the sort of presumptive model of what it meant to be an American, has changed very dramatically. Here he is in his dollhouse with his wife trying to figure out how to feed him. And there's lots of other stuff that I've left out. Fantastic, but he gets attacked by a cat and so on and so forth. I cannot recommend this film too much. So the Ames is based, there's a loose rhetoric in this, and it's a little bit hard to pin down. They based their work on this book, Cosmic View, by Ted Byfield, who is a Dutch, above all, pacifist. And he's to my knowledge, is the first person to really develop this kind of visual rhetoric. It's an absolutely fantastic book, and you can begin to see the page sequence here. Each one of these squares is a page, showing exactly the same movement, except that here he has a slightly more Dada aspect of it. If you see in the sort of toward the bottom right, you see the mother and child as a sort of very classic form. Again, inviting us to ask what subjective position, what demographic position would be looking at this mother and child. The answer, I think, probably is a man. But it's a little bit stranger. To the left of them, among other things, is a gigantic beach whale. So at the same time that the Case Booker was producing this kind of what seems in some ways to be the sort of origin of a sort of technocratic discourse, there's also an element of absurdity in it. It's a very, very beautiful book. Booker was driven by pacifism. His cause in life was to oppose war by any means possible, and one of the ways that he thought that we could do that would be through a kind of rhetoric that now has become quite familiar to us, the idea that if we step back, we can begin to see all of the difference, that we can begin to encompass all of these sort of, we can begin to see how trivial our differences are. And it's in that sense that you can begin to understand that initially, when people begin to think in terms of scaling, that it involved a very specific geopolitical position, or I shouldn't say geopolitical, kind of counter-geopolitical position, and one, but it was still very deeply political. By the time the Ameses get their hands on it, they depoliticize it in a very strange way. They made two versions of the film, one of which I think came out in 1968, and the other one came out in 1977. The first one is situated not in Chicago, as the familiar one is, but it's situated in Miami. Now, one of the strange things about their films is that in 1968, there were two national conventions of the major political parties in the United States. One was the Republicans and one was the Democrats. The Republicans met in Miami, and the Miami convention was quite traumatic. This is an image of disabled Vietnam veterans trying to bring pressure to the political system by staging a demonstration of people who at that point I think were still called invalids. It was quite traumatic and awful scene. Very serious for the American population. It was the first time I think that they had seen the police beating up on people who were in wheelchairs and things like that. So there's nothing particularly sort of abstract about it. It's strange that the Ameses would have chosen this. When they re-released their film several years later, they did the sort of Chicago remix of it. This is a scene from what happened in Chicago. So if we were to go back and look at the beginnings of this film again, not this one, sorry, actually I'm not going to go back, I don't feel like I have time. You'll see this very placid couple relaxing and having a picnic in a park in downtown Chicago that's about 2 blocks away from where the Chicago riots began. So, in many ways, I think it's the important thing to understand from this segment of the talk is the ways in which this kind of like seemingly neutral, seemingly placid, seemingly sort of technocratic model of design in fact, can also be read as a sort of depoliticizing of the field. Now, I really, really, really wish that I could get the sound working so that you could begin to see this. This is a pre-Sesame Street film in which Kermit is practicing visualization. He's reading a book about how visualization works. I think this is from 1962 or 63 or something like that. And he encounters a hep cat beatnik who's like, yeah, man, I do that too. And starts to describe this sort of fantastic thing where they're sort of going back and forth and practicing how to do the visualization. And Kermit's sort of like a little bit perplexed, trying these very basic exercises. And then zip ahead. The beatnik starts to talk about how he uses it in his musical composition, in his musical theory, in musical understanding. And he says basically that it worked really well when he was doing classical music, but then when he started to do jazz, everything fell apart. And he starts producing these completely irrational forms. And as they're going back and forth, he explains that one of the dangers of doing this is that gradually you end up in a situation where you can't, he says the way that you remove a visualization is to sing whatever you had sung backwards. But when you start doing jazz, you can't remember how to sing it backwards anymore. And as a result, you end up producing these more and more complicated situations that you cannot take back, that begin to sort of obscure or kind of occlude the actuality of what you're doing. And in the end of the film, they end up burying themselves in visualizations. They're no longer able to recognize the actual situation they're in. They disappear. It's an absolutely fantastic film. It used to be widely available on the net until whoever owns it decided to insert their intellectual property rights, at which point every copy of it vanished, and I just showed you a pirated copy. So, I think I can skip this kind of stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of recent history of this. Rough show of hands. How many of you have ever heard of this guy? That's a good sign, because a lot of you are raising your hands. For the last 15 or 20 years, he's been held aloft as a sort of the master of data visualization and information design, the guy who publishes these Bibles on the subject that explain how everything will work, how to do it perfectly. They're very strange books. They're quite beautiful. They're really remarkable pieces of work. They're not as original as he would like to make out, but anyway. So he's up. I'm afraid I don't have lost that slide there. One of the sort of main takeaways from his work is this idea of chart jump. If you had to sort of put him in a blender and then boil down the result, this is one of the main things that people have taken away. There's this sort of a quasi-Protestant notion. He has this idea of what he calls a data ink ratio, that you should maximize the amount of data and minimize the amount of ink, that everything else is wasteful. He starts to sound like some thrifty Scot or something like that, who feels like that we're wasting this ink. Where is it all going? So he goes on about this, but one of the sort of main positions that he articulates over the course of these books is this idea of chart junk. And he describes chart junk as excess nonsense that obscures what's going on and sort of just dissuades you. In many cases, it tends to be sort of like not so much a sort of technocratic model of visualization, but something that's more figurative. And here you have a couple of examples from around 2008, I think, of the economic collapse. And what you begin to see is the way in which data visualizations or sort of information design, these kinds of tools, are being deployed within a broader visual context. And that they become frameworks on which people sort of clamber or fall in their efforts to try to understand their own experience. And so you see on the one hand this sort of hapless guy clinging to this idea of what's going on and trying to figure out where it is. In the other, you see a much more polemical use of it. So Tufte goes on and says about chart junk. Now, things have changed a little bit. He used to be the godhead of this subject, but this is a series of searches that I think I did maybe 3 or 4 years ago on Google, trying to figure out if there was anyone in the world who disagreed with Edward Tufte. This is empirical evidence that at that point there was no one whatsoever. He's not full of shit. No one disagrees with him. He's not incorrect. He's not misguided. He hasn't made any mistakes. The list goes on and on and on. It's absolutely staggering. Now, fortunately, the situation has changed, and people are beginning to understand, I think, that there's a bit of an pendulum going on with this stuff. But still to this day, rather than seeing any substantive, historical, critical discourse around this, there's very, very little work at all. Most of the literature remains quite pragmatically oriented, and in that sense, I think is kind of, you could call it an affirmative discourse, if you do know what that means. Tufte has a strange quasi-historical argument, which again, I think is an important takeaway, that when you see people talking about this field, you'll see them produce one fantastic example or another fantastic example in this kind of strange, almost kind of Talmudic way, where there's sort of like, one will appear in Latvia in 1492, and then another one will appear in New York in 1989. But the efforts to sort of string them together into a coherent model of history, or understand why one would appear here or why one would appear there, are utterly failing. Tufte's claim is that the field was invented by William Playfair, someone who, as you can see, was working roughly around the sort of turn of the 19th century. Tufte says that he was a political scientist and that he was the first person to use information design for data visualization as a way to represent economic data, which is probably true. Playfair was also a charlatan, a scoundrel, a con man. He was on the lam for a good chunk of his life. He had to flee to France because he was one of the people who started a bank that was basically selling the historical equivalent of something like mortgage-backed securities, and the whole thing fell apart. He was also kind of a nut. He was at the scene when the Bastille was liberated, and I think was probably quite traumatized by this. And in between, started doing things like trying to produce multi-volume books that were basically catering. They were the sort of strange documents that were catering to the aristocracy by trying to prove how aristocratic they are. Here's an example of the kind of work that he did, and it is truly remarkable. Right? He did these fantastic images that really were genuinely innovative. I wish that I hadn't lost the slide earlier that shows the sequence of his titles, because they basically go from "in which I will show that Britain rules the world" to "oh shit." Watching the economic situation fall apart and watching the rise of powers around the world, not least of which is the United States. And if you look closely in this, you will see the rise of the United States and the collapse of the British economy in a very sort of straightforward way. Oh, no, here they are. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't do that slide after all. A commercial and political atlas representing by means of stained copper plates, blah, 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 blah. The whole of the 18th century, a statistical breviary, new things, a statistical account of the United States, and an inquiry into the permanent causes of decline and fall of powerful and wealthy nations. So apparently, his ability to produce data visualizations in information design or something like that led him to much more sort of unhappy conclusions than anyone likes to go on about. This is where I started tapping into this. This is an image of a couple pages in his book where he talks about where he got the idea. And he says, first of all, that he thinks that Europe is collapsing into a century of conflict. that he wants to develop a trans-historical, trans-cultural language, a language that anyone can understand in case civilization collapses, so that in the future they'll be able to know the really important stuff like why did it collapse. So he has an entire sort of large-scale historical argument that gets completely left out of any presentations of what his work is like. He also said that he wanted to know whether he was the first. And his argument is, yes, I think I was the first, except that I took it from this field called chronology. So, the chronology is a slightly different affair, and I'll show you. Chronology is a broad term that is used to describe an earlier model of historical representation and historical narrative, where rather than representing the years as sequential units, inserting this quantized form, that instead we use a sort of much more metaphorical forms of representation. So here you have, for example, history as a body, or history as a series of rivers, or history as a tree, or history as a wheel, or history as a temple, right? A very different model. You can begin to see at the same time, though, as these images move. And these are from a quite fantastic book, which is one of the best in the field, Chronologies of Time by Grafton and Rosenberg. You can begin to see this, the sort of the model of the river on the ground collapsing, and you can begin to see this more kind of architectonic construction of history that is beginning to sow the seeds of the kind of diagram that we saw in Rockwell. You can begin to see a kind of an architecture of dependencies and things like this. Now, chronology is not a neatly bounded field. It's not simply one where people sort of say, okay, well, here are the facts and we're going to choose the metaphors. Instead, it too is driven by very, very deep religious discourses. And so, for example, there's the work of Robert Flood, right? Very strange work indeed, which for some reason, Flood, against all odds and against everything we've ever been told, apparently understood that human beings are monkeys. Can you see this? At the center of all of the arts and sciences, what do you have but a monkey, right? This is in a sort of more, he was operating in a sort of more, I want to say, sort of Neo-Platonic model of thinking. On the right, you can begin to see this sort of like a strange machine. It's not a functional machine of wheels. It's not cogs, but rather it's a sort of series of sort of more or less loosely symbolic realms that are connected to each other through a different model of humanity that we've seen. Other prominent examples, this one's my favorite because my middle name is Kepler, is this guy who on the one hand brought us what we now know as the laws of planetary motion. This is the guy who figured out that things don't move in circles but rather ellipses. But his work, strangely, included these very sort of cosmic visions on the one hand and also an absolute fascination with cognition on the other. And on the right-hand side, you can see cross-sections of eyeballs and a sort of detailed anatomy of eyeballs. And to me, it's quite interesting that someone working, 400 years ago or so would have made this connection between the macro and the micro in this way. There is some absolutely spectacular work that I cannot recommend enough that has gone into a more detailed understanding of the relationship between the construction of society, the construction of the subject, the construction of philosophy, and the construction of visuality. These are two good examples. Jonathan Crairy's Techniques of the Observer and Rebecca Solnit's River of Shadows. They're complementary books. They're both fantastically written, and they talk about the rise of a series of tools from zoetropes, kinetoscopes, phenakistoscopes, practinoscopes, I think. A series of mechanisms that originated in different parts of Europe and the United States that were used as instruments of investigation, instruments of representation, and an effort to begin to move beyond static images and to reconstruct our understanding of time, effects, perception, and phenomena. They did so in a way that is key. They did so by slicing the world up in different directions. And so, for example, you'll see here a man looking at a mirror through a series of slots in this that rely on these physiological effects to produce an illusion of motion. I wish I could remember. I'm always bad at remembering which ones these are. I think this is a praxinoscope or something like that. An early version of a sort of cinematic enterprise. These very famous images, Edward Muybridge's sort of seminal work on the gait of a horse. This guy, Etienne Jules Marais, a French person who in many ways was working in a mode that was similar to Muybridge's, but also crucially different in its technical apparatus, in its cultural idiom, in its purpose, in its relationship to the broader landscapes of worlds that he was working in. Solnit's book is especially good on this. She talks about the relationship between the fragmentation of time and the fragmentation of movement on the one hand, and the total destruction of the West and the reconstruction of a different model of America on the other. And she makes a very beautiful argument about how our construction, sort of the destruction of a sort of more immediate world and our ability to capture images of, quote, nature and things like that allowed us to construct a different model of what a nation was and what a culture was. Marais was working in an absolutely different idiom, in an absolutely different place, and yet was involved in some of the same things. And so what we begin to see here is the effects of industrialization on perception. But crucially, again, the operation here is to take what seemed prior to that to be a continuous flow of phenomena and reduce them to a series of slices. This is the kind of philosophical procedure that is typically blamed on digitization or on computers, and in fact is not related to them at all. And disentangling the effects of computation and the tools of computation is a very, very important tool, is a very important way to understand and begin to sort of disassemble the rhetoric of what we typically call information. Another fantastic Marais image of a guy pole vaulting. At another place, in another time, slightly, there was this man, a rather portly man, who seems to be holding an almost inexplicable object. He seems to be a handcrafted data visualization. What's up with grams and the data visualization? This is Frank Gilbreth, who is the father of time and motion studies. An effort is one of the first significant areas of activity that combine both a sort of an understanding of what we now call ergonomics on the one hand, the sort of the intimate movements of what it means to be a human being in a particular physical setting, and on the other hand, industrial rationalization. Gilbreth was, his goal in life was to make life easier and better for workers so that they could make more money for you, right? One of the ways that he would do these was these sort of quite fantastic situations where he would produce these sort of graduated grids on the back, on all of the sort of horizontal surfaces around someone working, and then you connect small lights to different parts of their to their fingers, to their wrists, to their elbows, and then take long exposure photographs that would show you how the person moved. And on that basis, he began to slice these things up, slice up these movements into a more kind of disconnected way of understanding what it was, and use that as a basis for rationalizing physical activity. He couldn't think of what to call these things, so he just spelled his name backward and called them therapeutic. And he's a sign, I think, of a little bit of the sort of madness that was running through the sort of, again, not data visualization or information design or whatever you want to call it, understood as an abstract, flat activity, but rather as something that sort of penetrates the world and begins to slice our own experience up, largely in a sort of financial mode. Here's a series of comparative sculptures that he had made, and these could have stepped right out of some like surrealist enterprise. I don't entirely understand what this is, and I also don't understand why there is a pulley at the bottom underneath this table. I really would love to see what this thing did, because it appears to have been a machine for simulating some kind of activity or something like that. Excuse me. Again, we can see here in a sketch by Norman Blackwell a different way of sort of interpolating these kinds of experiences into a much more mundane thing. Here you see the classic piece of Americana, a boy and his dog with a stereogram. Here he is, and he's depicted in this kind of strange non-space, and I'll get back to this sort of Rockwellian non-space in a second, absolutely absorbed in an imaginary situation, and spending his time sort of, he's completely sort of like, he is a representation of someone engaged in an early form of immersive media. There are other ways in which we can begin to sort of peel away analytical diagrams. This one doesn't necessarily have so much to do with what I'm talking about, but I really like to show it. This is a series of a couple of diagrams by Bernard Rudowski for an exhibition at the MoMA in 1943. The one on the left depicts all of the buttons on a finely pointed gentleman, and the one on the right depicts all of the pockets. insane. But here you can see, again, a sort of strange contrast between an almost kind of caricature of a human form on the one hand, and on the other hand, a much more sort of analytical enterprise that has been removed from the realm of haberdashery and put into a much more sort of sophisticated kind of rational enterprise of what a person is. I mean, and it's very clear from an exhibition in the moment in 1943 that Rudowski was pushing for a sort of a different understanding of what modernity will be in its relationship to a human body and how we appoint our lives. This is a relatively famous book cover. I don't think I want to get dragged down this particular path at this talk. You almost never see the other photo that comes with it. This fantastically staged image of people, again involved in a different kind of socially immersive form of media, which itself is staged. They were not really doing this. There's no possibility. And of course, here's a sort of, again, a sort of a more, one of the sort of great-grandchildren of Norman Rockwell's, of his immersive media. But if I were to show these slides backwards or in a different order, I think very few people ever would have made the connection, or have thought for a moment that this is like an early heads-up display or something like that, because we don't usually put HUDs in the same sentence as Norman Rockwell. Okay. So back. Some of you probably know this abbreviation TMR, for too much information. This is the claim that we're absolutely drowning in this sort of panicked, stricken mode that we can never manage, that we're struggling to keep up, and so on and so forth. This is sort of technocratic representation of some very tragic kind of existential model of what it means to be a human being. This is one of the mantras of the TMI thing. You'll hear this sort of, blah blah edition of the New York Times contains more information than blah blah. It's a kind of verbal textual rhetoric that is constantly deployed, this sort of claim, to show how complicated life is. Now, what's so strange about this is that in the very act of making quantitative claims of what's going on, it also seems to be a license for total bullshit. In the sense that someone will just sit there and say, pick their random figure of like some other historical person who lived in some completely different setting. I have not verified that the origin of this claim about the Times originated, I think, in 1851 and referred to a newspaper called the Manchester Times. So that it's just kind of this meme, this sort of like this sort of like century or 2-century-old meme that's been sort of drifting around. This is another typical claim that's sort of a kind of pseudo-quantitative rhetoric that's invoked to justify the ideological claim that there is too much information. You'll hear roughly how quickly knowledge or recorded knowledge or printed knowledge or human knowledge or the reservoir of world knowledge or printed information, blah, 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 blah. All these kinds of things are just made up on the spot. But all we know is that it's doubling. If you actually sit down and try to do the math of what this doubling has, you'll very quickly find that it does not work and that the Earth itself would collapse under the weight of the stuff. This is a strange painting by Norman Rockwell that I think in many ways summarizes a kind of a mid-century sort of point here. I don't remember exactly when it was painted. Here's a man, again, a very finely appointed gentleman. He has his umbrella, he has his Homburg, he probably has very nice cufflinks, staring into the abyss of some inexplicable modernity. Right? He's looking at a Jackson Pollock painting and trying, you can tell from his body language, he's trying to understand it. He's trying to understand it, but he also doesn't really totally get it. And Rockwell he has his strong points and his weak points, but one of them is, I think, he's a remarkable talent for gesture, for sort of capturing certain qualities of gestures. And you can see from the small of the man's back that he's sort of leaning back and he's not really going with this program too well. But at the same time, he himself, if you look at his feet, is sort of sitting in some strange non-space. Right? There's really no way in which this image can spatially make sense. And in that sense, we could look at this and say, well, this looks like it was probably the cover of the Saturday Evening Post or something like that. But in another way, it captures in a very pop discourse this sort of dramatization. I meant to pull the caption off of this slide. In the next one, the caption itself is a kind of homage to this filmmaker Adam Curtis. If you don't know his work, you should immediately. He's awesome. This is an advertisement that was produced by IBM to explain what's going on. Sorry. And it shows, I want you to watch for the doctor's hand as it comes in. you'll see this baby, this image of humanity that's radiating information. It's just these clouds of it as though we're sort of like the molecules of some fresh baby scent. Watch the hand. The hand does not radiate any information at all. It exists in a completely different kind of epistemological framework, a completely different visual model. It's coextensive in the space, but the failure of it to radiate any information at all tells us a great deal about the social relationship here. The body of the baby is the subject, and the hand of the doctor does not exist. It's not a part of the situation. It's there and yet not there. And hidden in that, I think you can begin to see sort of another representation of the power line, the sort of the construction of power that's going on here. This is a thing that I made a few years ago. I was interested in this kind of, what happened to this supposedly serene drifting away from Earth. On the left, again, we see the powers of 10. On the right, we see, cut by cut, all of the sequential images from the film Enemy of the State. All I did was go through and cut out all the parts where we weren't moving away along this axis. And what you see is something very different, a frenetic, terrifying, paranoid model of what it means to be a human being on the run, what it means to experience it, what it means to visualize it, all of these things. You'll see, in many respects, the same kind of visual language, but redeployed in a very different way, and in a way that suggests that this serenity itself is collapsing, that we can no longer count it. Or alternatively, that serenity is somehow become the property of the state, and that it's being mobilized against us. The ability to move along that axis belongs to a government that is increasingly alienated from society itself and is serving its own purposes. We could watch this for a little while, but I think you get the basic idea, and I should probably move on. So, okay. Now I think you have an understanding of what I'm talking about. These are some of the sort of typical names that are used: information design, data visualization, information visualization, scientific visualization, information architecture, infographics, and my favorite, explanation graphics, which is much more modest. When I started first researching into this, people would say, oh, you can't possibly lump all of these things together. They don't fit together. Those cheesy infographics that you see in USA Today don't have anything at all to do with scientific visualization and so on and so forth. And I thought, yes they do. But I spent a couple of years trying to figure out exactly what they did have in common with each other. My argument was that the visual artifacts there's nothing intrinsically scientific about a drawing. Any more than, for example, there's anything intrinsically scientific about a guy wearing a white lab coat. But that does not make you a scientist, and doesn't make what you do science. By the same token, it's like, banging away on a typewriter or whatever, it doesn't make you a journalist. So, disentangling the visual artifacts from the social context and practices within which they take place, I think is a very key way to understand what these things are. But then you end up with a formal question: what are they and how do you describe them? So this is my rough stab at a definition of what these objects are. It's hyper-formalist. You have an abstract, quasi-mathematical figure that's represented as a discrete object. You almost never see it falling off the page. You almost never see it from the back. It's represented as a sort of discrete subject that can be talked about. It exists in a larger qualitatively different non-space. For example, the sort of medicalized and demedicalized space of the doctor's hand. That's where you see the doctor existing in a different space. The observer isn't included or integrated into this non-space by a vision or perspective. That accounts for third position and that IBM at, which is the presence of the camera itself. The camera exists in a different space from the doctor, from the baby. And so you can begin to see these sort of axes of movement deployed in ways that suggest different kinds of political stances. For any of you, which I think is probably none of you, who have ever read anything but the Soviet literary historian Mikhail Bakhtin, he has a fantastic argument about the nature of the novel. He argues that the novel itself is a terminal literary genre that is capable of absorbing all other genres. And number 4 is a kind of hat tip to Bakhtin. The idea of a construction of space that can absorb any of these things: texts, quantities, images, and so on and so forth, and yet retain its integrity. And finally, the use of arbitrary non-alphanumeric symbols, dots, lines, fields, and so on and so forth, that in a coherent way. Can you tell me what time it is, someone? 5 past, okay, so I got a ways to go. Good. Here is a famous film made by, or sort of kinetoscope made by Thomas Edison of a sneeze. And you can see a sequence of images that have been deployed in a way that sort of reconstructs time as though it were a spatial phenomenon. From one to the next, you'll see this man who's in the framing of him, both the framing, each individual frame, but the sort of construction is sort of total rigorous space as though it were a kind of spreadsheet of existence or something like that. Everything is absolutely rational about it. I'll explain why I'm going to show this one in a second. Here are the problems with information design, or as I like to call it, informational imagery. That overall, it tends to present these idealized, almost Neoplatonic shapes, squares and circles in this way that suggest that they're sort of manageable. They become these sort of bird cages that can contain the supposed chaos and excess that we're constantly dealing with. That for every stated variable, there are infinite unstated variables. Right? I'll get to that one in a little bit, or maybe I'll just skip it. It's a bit complicated. I've been banging on about number 3, so I don't need to explain it. The hybridization presents wildly different elements of data, matrices, and variables as equally and integrally true, as though they somehow fit together. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And you end up with using sort of graphic conventions that to impose homogenizing visual language on basically everything ever. This is another representation of a sneeze that was done by Winsor McCay, as you can see, his comic Little Sandy Sneeze, that I think presents a very different way of understanding what this phenomenon is. And one that is grounded in a different model of humanity, where the sort of eruptive force of humanity is actually capable of destroying the frameworks that are, that are meant to hold it. If you don't know Winsor McCay's work, none of you should be in the program. He basically invented animated cartoons, and they are fantastic from beginning to end. To this day, people are struggling to keep up with what the work that this guy was doing when he invented it. But again, here you see something that is presented as kind of adorable or cute or something like that. But implied in it is, I think, a certain kind of, is the potential of a kind of political discourse as well, of this sort of eruptive moment of humanity, the sneeze, and like a sort of thing that makes no sense, that's capable of sort of destroying our effort to frame it in the way that Edison, the inventor, did. Okay, so, probably some of you know these animated films by RSA, these RSA animations. This is one that's done by Manuel Lima. He's on our faculty, so I should be a little bit delicate in how I describe this. Manuel seems to think, and hint at the end of this animation, that on the basis of an apparent visual similarity between, on the left, the smallest scale, and on the right, the largest scale, that he has discovered that everything is related. Now, from my perspective, this is an amazing claim because it's patently obvious that everything is related. Always. It always was and always will be. And the idea that what we would do is strip away everything and produce these sort of static images of what he goes on to call, what he calls these things that are rational and irrational, kind of strangely homogeneous networks. The fact that things look big, the things that are at the largest and the smallest scale look the same, seems to be a revelation. That would be a revelation to someone like Robert Flood or to Johannes Kepler. We have known this for thousands of years, that everything is kind of the same. And it's only recently, apparently, we forgot it. And the idea that visualizations are the way that we've discovered it show that visualizations are not a way of understanding things, that they are actually a way of forgetting them, a way of getting rid of all of the complexity, all of the messiness. They're the things that allow us to for Gaia to expand and for humanity to become a cosmic civilization, as opposed to just do something like pass a budget for next year, right? Or for even tomorrow. Here's another screen grab from the RSA animation of Manuel's work. And I should be very clear here. The animations were not done by Manuel. He did not do them. He did a talk and worked collaboratively with RSA in a way so that they, if anything, I think, bear a certain amount of responsibility for it. But if you take a step back again and look at the composition of this image, you'll see a very strange thing, and that is a series of kind of very diverse spatial constructions. You have like a sort of grid-like globe. You have a man in this sort of, again, in a sort of idealized form. You'll have on the bottom right this sort of specializations for insects, which is an absolute ideological claim, and then you'll also see this sort of universalist language of no. language, text, diagrams, connections, perspectives, someone floating in a balloon looking at a map, and the map itself is folded. You see an enormously complex spatial construction here, all in the service of the claim that this is somehow revelatory, and I think it's not. Okay. This is always a slightly difficult part of this talk because it doesn't really fit into the theme here, but I think it's an important one to bring up. I don't know if any of you have run across this guy, Walter Benjamin. If you haven't, you should. He was a really sweet guy. Things didn't work out for him so well. He was inspired by this Paul Klee painting, Angelus Novus, to write one of his theses on the philosophy of history. It's the one that is unfortunately most cited, and I think it's the one that people have the hardest time understanding, in which he's talking about the angel of history and describing this fantastic situation of an angel that in this almost kind of Hitchcockian way is sort of perpetually in the state of sort of zooming back out of the situation and is both sort of hovering within it and hovering without it. And is trying to get away. He's being blown back by the sort of wind of progress that's having caught in his wings, but he's struggling against it in an effort to try to intervene in this wreckage called civilization, called progress, and called history. I have a nice little thing, a series of studies where I tried to sort of translate this Benjaminian passage into a series of algorithms to explain the sort of the kind of entanglement or the sort of interdependencies here. It's a sort of strangely algorithmic passage for something that, for all intents and purposes, really seems to be almost sort of mystical. And it isn't almost mystical. His best friend, Gershom Scholem, went on to legitimize the subject of mysticism. But this is something that he wrote in 1940. Again, at this sort of transitional point in civilization, he was a German Jew who was fleeing from the fascists and was desperately struggling to understand his point, like what he could mean for a human being to exist in the face of this rampant technology that seemed to be captivating and transforming civilization and turning it into some sort of like monstrous creation. I think in many ways, a lot of what we do when we're dealing with data visualization of these sort of informational images is a similar kind of thing. Trying to construct images that seem like they can contain chaos, but at the same time that we can step outside of them and see it from a sort of safe distance where they're manageable, they're proportional, they're level, they're homogeneous, and so on and so forth. These tools themselves, the visualizations, the informations themselves, are machines. They're visual machines, they're logical machines, they're conceptual machines, and I will show you how. This is a kind of simple XY chart that we totally understand, right? The idea of sort of mapping time versus space or something like that. The notion that time exists on the horizontal or x-axis is absolutely conventional in these things, and it's really unfortunate. There are people who feel that it should do otherwise. But I could make another one as well, in a reference to this sort of 70s model of feminism. It sort of produces sort of like strange things of fish bicycles, or I could do unicorn memes, right? Or I could do like stuff and nonsense, I could do clapping hands and clapping. You can use these tools to produce objects that do not exist, and in essence, that is what they do. They lend aesthetic form, and in doing so, lend a seeming material reality to units that are heterogeneous and don't make any sense. We're used to the idea that time and space are somehow fungible and that they have anything to do with each other. They do not. They operate very differently on very different planes. And yet, this is the simplest form I could possibly produce. There's not even a z-axis. There are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of variations on this that I could use to convince you, if I was a slightly different disposition, that things that do not exist do exist. And that's what these things do. That is why they are essential to tools like to these discourses like financialization, to planning, to bureaucratization, to standardization, to neoliberalism and globalization. In many ways, I think they can be understood as the sort of, as I sometimes call them, the stained glass windows of neoliberalism or the stained glass windows of globalization. They're heterogeneous, idealized, geometric forms that can encompass all of these different objects that produce a sort of synthetic discourse. So here we have, for example, apparently the coordinate 1 unicorn per meme, or something like that. What does this mean? We have different, this is an example of what I mean. We have very different ways of thinking about what time is. So this is a sort of rough graph that shows you supposedly the scale of time. right? From the second to the millennium or something like that. And it appears to produce a kind of homogeneous field where you say, okay, of course, 6.689 from 10 to the 12th, no problem, whatever, I can work with that, right? This is the realm that a human being, a single human being, can actually experience in any meaningful way. This tiny little wedge at the bottom of it. The rest is largely imaginary. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that we don't need to think about it. But it does mean it begins to show you, in a way, it's a way of using visualization to show the weaknesses of visualization. We have very different ways of describing time. Moments, whiles, laters, your teenage, your 20s, your 30s, middle age, retirement, seasons, all these different ways. There's a much more heterodox way of describing time as we experience it that cannot be captured in any of these quantitative forms. And it's very important to understand that these quantizations of life and everything in it are not necessarily your friends. They are not being deployed in order to make your life better by any stretch of the imagination. They represent external frameworks and external standpoints that are very different from your world. And as I pointed out earlier, increasingly are becoming, it seems, the sort of privileged standpoint of corporations or the state. Ben Fry, co-inventor of processing, which some of you have been subjected to, says, and this is the first sentence of a dissertation that was passed by MIT. It was accepted as doctoral level work at MIT. If you open the book up, this is the first thing you'll read. The ability to collect, store, and manage data is increasing quickly, but our ability to understand it remains constant. This is, again, typical of the kind of like quantitative rhetoric that is so typical, that's typical of this stuff. But what does it mean? Is it really true that our ability to understand it remains a constant? So here I'm going to show you 3 different ways to interpret what Fry says. If the blue line is our ability to collect, store, and manage data, and the red line is our ability to understand data, I can produce 3 different graphs that are equally true to describe this, right? They represent 3 radically different models of how to think about what is true. One is optimistic, where it's like, we're working toward it, we don't really need to worry about it. That sort of moment that some people call the singularity may be off in the future, but it doesn't really matter. Our ability to understand it still far outstrips the amount that we can produce. In the second one, we're just screwed from the beginning. There's no possibility ever of catching up. The third one is the one that I think is most often deployed, and that is the sort of sense that there's some sort of impending cataclysm or something like that. The other thing that I haven't even bothered to do with this series of drawings is show you where is now on the horizontal axis. It could be at the beginning, it could be at the end. And by reframing these 3 equally true representations of an ideological statement, I can produce completely different outcomes. That is the essence of data visualization and informational imagery. And I'm going to give you a completely concrete example. On the subject of murder, that subject that is most human. This is one of the first interactive projects, sort of substantial interactive projects that the New York Times produced. A map of the murders in New York City. When you loaded the page, this is what you would see. You would see, apparently, that New York City is an extremely dangerous place, right? People are getting murdered constantly. Except that this is murders between 2003 and 2009, all of which are presented as happening exactly at the same time, which is now. And you say, well, what's the possible benefit of doing this? And you begin to realize that more than anything else, this is probably a strangely formulated feature that was released with a strong eye toward driving up real estate values in certain neighborhoods. The only reason anyone actually looks at the murder map is to see whether or not they should buy an apartment there, nothing else. So what you see is a city in a format that really no one can experience, with a representation of history piled on top of it that also is just not true, and yet is presented in this absolutely standard language. When you start to look closer, you'll see they have certain basic data fields that are associated with the month and time of it, the race and ethnicity of the victim, in a city where race and ethnicity are becoming increasingly unclear. Thank God, if you believe in God. Here they have the most regressive construction of humanity: sex, race, age, weapon used, and this kind of stuff, right? As you start to zoom in, you see a different model of the city, and you can start to see a very different kind of, you can start to see clumping that make you say, well, why is this going on right there? Why, for example, at the bottom right, are there so many murders down in sort of like in East Harlem or something like that? If you zoom in a little farther, you begin to see a very different model of the city, where you can see these sort of extruded sandboard maps that show you the beginnings of architectural detail. And you can also begin to intuit things like, oh, maybe all of those murders didn't take place in public settings on the sidewalk. Maybe they took place, as most murders do, in private settings between people who knew each other, and that danger doesn't really have anything to do with you unless you were in a horrifically abusive relationship or something like that. But as you get closer, you begin to see that this image that New York Times produces is absolute rubbish from beginning to end. When you get closer still, you start to see very strange things. For example, this is Mohammed Afzal, I think. This is the detail that shows where he died, supposedly. And it's like right at that crook of Prospect Park. This is where he's recorded as having died. He was a poor homeless guy who was murdered. That's not actually where he died. The red dot indicates where he actually died. But they couldn't show it because the police report on which the data was based they need to have an address. No one can die unless they die at an address. And so what they did was, the poor guy, they mentally moved him to the nearest address. So it's like homeless guy, and it's homeless in life, homeless in death. That's the way it goes. And you begin to see some of it, again, on a very different level, the kinds of distortions that can take place. And then you finally realize these are based on police reports. And that is the origin of the incredibly productive demographics. And if any of you have ever had the opportunity to call the police in New York City, you'll oftentimes find you say, I saw a guy doing this. And the first question that you will get, I'm afraid to say, is, was he black? Right. Every time I've had to call the cops about something, that's the first question I get asked. I can't stand it. It's basically, I won't call the cops anymore because it's an existential crisis for me. You do this. So, what happened to all of this glamorous information that's transforming our lives and reconstructing our understanding of the world? It's nowhere. Another example, some strange map of conflicts, apparently in all of human history. Someone who's got some really good data sources on every war that's ever been fought. Again, as you start to look a little more closely, you see very, very strange things. You can see the cursor kind of around Texas or so. That apparently one of the wars that was fought was in Waco. You know about the Great Battle of Waco. This was when the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms people besieged some strange cultish group and then did a really bad job of it and everyone died. But anyway, the uniformity of this kind of visual representation, this kind of alarming red dot, used as a sort of standard trope for representing where something happened. As you start to get a little bit closer, you can see how absolutely conventionalized and sort of meaningless this representation is. This is the use of a standard and this is where we get to a kind of fork in the road. If you go back to Edward Tufte, you will remember that he was very opposed to this idea of chart junk. He didn't like the use of pictures as a way of understanding information. And so this is one of the results where you see a sort of standard form used to represent a particular event called, quote, war, unquote, or, quote, conflict, unquote, or something like that. We need to go back to the prelude to World War II to understand that. Abu Neurath is widely known as a logical positivist philosopher and sometimes fellow traveler of the communists and much else besides. It's a little bit hard to describe the complexity or sort of like stunning nature of his work. He was very committed to a socialist reconstruction of society, and he believed very strongly that we should use all tools of communication, all tools of philosophy, all tools of visual representation to build a different world. He's not widely known. Probably most of you don't know that he is the author of this fantastic, ubiquitous figure, the bathroom man and the bathroom woman. Every bathroom you've ever seen, you see this guy hanging out or this woman hanging out on the door. Thanks, Otto. He worked with a Dutch designer to produce these these really remarkable images. Bathroom man, or Helvetica man, as he's sometimes called, has become this kind of hapless figure. He's usually getting his hand cut off, or he always has to go to the bathroom because he doesn't speak the local language. He's getting crushed by machines. He's like slipping and falling. He's become this sort of like this kind of universal clown figure or something like that. This is not how he was intended at all. He was intended instead to be the kind of Lego block of civilization, the representation of the capacity, of human capacity. And so, for example, here you'll see a picture, an image taken from Neurath's book, The Making of Modern Man, in which you'll see the use of repetition as a single figure to indicate scales of proportion, scales of proportion and capacities. This is a very different way of looking at these things. Tufte was totally opposed to this. He didn't like this. He believes very strongly that you should use proportion, expanding and contracting images to explain how and the different sort of capacities or potentials or sort of scales of what's going on. Neurath's view was very interesting. He believed that time, the time axis in every one of these diagrams should go up and down. That when it goes past you horizontally, that you get this sort of sense that history is leaving you behind, that it's sort of like a train ride or something like that. Neurath wanted to go straight down the middle and come right up between your legs and make you recognize that you were a potential historical actor. And it was toward that end that he developed this system called isotype, which was an effort to produce a critical political vocabulary that was legible to the semi-literate working masses. He wanted to produce a vision of a Marxist society, a way of communicating Marxist theory to people who couldn't read. That is the origin of Helvetica Man and Laughing Man. So again, the fact that he's been sort of appropriated and used and turned into this hapless figure rather than as an expression of the sort of force that he could have been is, again, I think, worth considering politically. As an example, an amazing magazine that was published, I think, in Vienna. I could be wrong about that. Leipzig, that Neurath contributed to, which represents a different model of humanity than we understand. This is statistics and class war. Right. So you don't get to see Mr. Bliss, who's the sort of strange opposite of him. It doesn't really make sense. He's a sort of mad guy who took the other path from Neurath. Rather than sort of engaging with politics, he tried to come up with a universal language and ended up working for young disabled children in Ontario. In The Making of Modern Man by Neurath, there's a chapter called The State of the World. In it is some absolutely lucid drawings, or sort of rhetoric describing what was going on on the eve of World War II. He published it in 1930, on the eve of America's involvement in World War II. And in it, he tried to explain the relationship between text, language, political theory, and the production of a new form of possibility. This project was later taken up and subsequently been totally valorized by Michael. So it was taken up by Michael Pickard and Ron Segal, who were a couple of really solid English Marxists, who produced something called the State of the World Atlas. You should all run over immediately to the Strand and buy a copy. It's one of the most remarkable books ever, not least of which because it's the experiments in cartography and information design are really brilliant. They produce map after map after map, whatever you use. Their techniques are so heterogeneous that it's really hard to use a single language to describe it, to describe the terrifying state of the modern world. So I'm only showing you 1, 7, 12, these kinds of things. Again, very different sort of heterogeneous spaces, and we see in some ways, like in the way that Manuel Weber was working, we see very different sort of representational techniques deployed on the same page, but toward a different end than sort of this sort of panicky rhetoric of what we don't understand it, we're struggling to keep up. Instead, it's very much in the service of a much stronger model of what it means to be human and what it can mean to build society. I'm breaking lots of rules in presentations, and now I'm going to break the too much text rule. Some of the writing in the State of the World Atlas, the original editions that were published by Pluto and subsequently by Penguin in the 80s, are absolutely fantastic. The ways in which they frame this rhetoric have nothing to do with panic and nothing to do with information, sort of like an excess of information at all. This is the real key here. What they say, and they said this in 1983, was already that states and corporations, multinational corporations, had begun to recognize the dangers of transparency and the dangers of access to information. And that on that basis, they were withdrawing information out of concern that would allow people to establish a comparative framework and to understand where things are really going. this is way before most of the sort of panicky rhetoric that's come to dominate us. Here we have solid socialists telling us there's too much information, but there's too little information. That information is a political instrument, and that the ability to represent it is a very, very potent political tool that is grounded in a long established leftist tradition. It's within that framework that if you go back and look at people like Edward Tufte, you'll see that his work is in many ways, one of the reasons he's become such a favorite is that he's completely valorizing and depoliticizing this. This is done, and I'm just going to leave you with this last fantastic visualization that explains more than I possibly could have in days and days and days. A visualization of housing crisis. Have any of you seen this before? You're in for a treat. Again, it's better with the sound because you have this kind of terrifying sound, sort of like a mechanized existence, and one in which you're absolutely at the mercy of this machine. But one in which you can also see the narrative ahead, right? It's a very conscious visual strategy on the part of the people who made this film to allow you to see what was coming as a way of dramatizing and staging the story told through quantities. But rather than being told from a disembodied standpoint, it's told from an absolutely concrete standpoint. And it tells a very different story than this kind of serenity, or this sort of, this effort to sort of cage the experience of something like real estate prices means. And I think that that'll probably do you. Did I go over? Yes, that would be a yes. Okay, so if you want to ask me questions, I think you're probably going to have to ask me in the lab or something like that. But I hope you enjoyed this talk and learned something from it. Thank you very much.